The day I found out my mom lied about cancer, my world shattered. Hi, Reddit. I never thought I'd write this out loud, but when life throws you stories like this, staying silent becomes impossible. Not because I'm seeking pity, but because sometimes you need to lay it all out to sort through the chaos piece by piece. And if any of you have ever dealt with family secrets, you'll understand why I decided to share this. My name is Daniel. I'm 32. I live in a suburb of Amsterdam, work at a small design studio, get along with people at the pub, but not as a waiter, as a drinker. And yeah, I had a normal life until one phrase my mother uttered that shattered my entire familiar world. I have cancer, Mom said, sitting at the kitchen table, and her voice was so steady as if she were just giving a weather forecast. She added, "Don't panic, baby. The doctors said the chances are good. We'll fix everything." And at that moment, I thought it would all be like in a movie. Persistent doctors, surgeries, diets, emotional scenes, candles, and then remission and honey toast in a small family circle. I believed it because Mom's name is Sophie, and she's always been the one who knows how to hold the stage. A smile, a touch of drama, a convincing voice, and my whole life, people have been drawn to her like she was a magnet. She's always known how to get what she wanted, but I never thought she'd use it against me. When she said cancer, everything inside me froze and started spinning on autopilot at the same time. I immediately remembered childhood days, how she fed me soup, gave me warm scarves in winter, came to friends' parents to give high praise to my endeavors. She was an example of resilience and care for many. And so everything that came after, I took as a debt of honor. Quit my job, rearrange my schedule, move her in with me, look after her. I thought that's what a son does, and I was ready. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of Hilversum, where the noise from the trams rarely reaches, and in winter the dry air cuts your face, and Mom always said that this is where you can live peacefully. A bit of Dutch order, a bit of garden chaos. The first weeks were typical: doctor visits, tests, queues, consultations. Mom held up easily. She'd come to the studio where I worked, smile at colleagues, talk on the phone about a new stage, and ask not to make scenes for her when that day comes. And I saw how people got used to the role, as if we were all strolling in a theatrical production. I remember that first evening when I got up at 1 in the morning and caught myself counting the minutes until her call, because it seemed like my duties now included constant presence. Buy medications, bring soup, arrange hospitalization, remember appointment schedules. I got used to it and thought it was nothing unusual. That's how many people live, until one day you start noticing odd little things, mismatched puzzle pieces, because the script, no matter how touching, sometimes leaves traces behind. Let me say right away, Mom was artistic but not pathologically so. She knew how to speak so that people believed her, and always knew how to show vulnerability at the right moment. I loved her for that, and hugging her was a habit. But somewhere between the second and third visit to the oncologist, a strange feeling started forming in my head. Not doubt about the illness itself, but some tangible inconsistency between the doctor's words, the real medical documentation, and what Mom was telling me. And that's when I first felt a cold rush of anxiety, which I unfortunately chalked up to exhaustion from sleepless nights. The first months passed in a fog. I worked during the day, and in the evening sat by Mom's bed. We watched black and white films she loved and talked about life, and at some point this rhythm became almost a pleasant routine. I was proud that I could be there, that I could care for her, and that pride gave me the strength not to notice details that now, looking back, seem alarming. I paid for medications, coordinated physio, signed documents, and it all seemed logical, until one little piece of paper became the first pebble in the avalanche. It was a simple receipt for payment at a private clinic in a neighboring district of Amsterdam, neatly punched lines with the amount, date, signature of the reception staff. I took that receipt because I wanted to check the expenses. Mom's finances always seemed a bit tangled to me. She had debts after the divorce from Dad and a couple of credit lines. And to be honest, I always kept a hand on her papers, considering it care. But when I read it, it turned out some procedures were paid for earlier than Mom called me about the appointment. There were dates that didn't match Mom's stories about how the doctor said to wait. At first, I chalked it up to bureaucracy, to errors, but an inner voice said, "Look further." I kept quiet, held it in for almost a week, because it seemed to me that if I started asking now, I'd destroy what was already barely holding together. Mom, our routine, her peace. But the anxiety grew because the small inconsistencies multiplied. She talked about chemotherapy, but I didn't see traces in her medical history at the department where she claimed she had the procedure. She mentioned doctors' names that no one at the clinic had ever heard of. And one day I saw that the box of medication, which she said was needed every week, was still sealed. It all sounds paradoxical. How can you doubt when it's about something like cancer? I understood the moral complexity and so stayed silent for a long time, but deep down it became clear to me that I had to understand the truth, because continuing to live in the theater that Mom herself was staging around her meant losing myself. I thought about how the people around us, friends, neighbors, colleagues, saw her and believed, and if I started digging, it could destroy not only her illusion but also relationships with everyone else. But truth isn't something you can put off for later, because a lie, especially one like this, grows like mold and devours everything else. And yet, at the moment when I first opened the folder with her documents and saw the inconsistencies, I couldn't imagine how far this story would escalate, and how monstrous the consequences would turn out to be. I couldn't foresee that after the medical spectacle would come a series of debts, blackmail, shocking confessions, and that finally, the truth would prove not just painful but destructive. Not only for Mom, but for our family, for me personally, for the life I cherished so much. I think care is a drug that erodes the boundaries of reality to the point where you start believing any story if it's accompanied by tears and pleas for help, and I'm no exception. In the first months, when Mom announced her diagnosis, I was ready to give everything for her: time, money, ambitions. And it seemed normal to me that a son should sacrifice himself for his mother, because an archaic standard sat in my head that family is where we pay with love and care. But when care becomes a tool of manipulation, and when the one you love uses your kindness as currency, you quickly start to understand the price you're paying. My studio in the center of Hilversum was my sanctuary, a small bright office with a view of the canal, a couple of plants that died more often than I wanted, and a desk where ideas were born. After Mom started being sick, I increasingly brought her boxes to the office: smears, outdated checkups, first aid kits, bottles of pills. Colleagues first took it with sympathy, then got used to it, and at some point it became awkward for me, because work required concentration, and my head was always there in Mom's kitchen, where she seemed to be playing a role she wrote herself. Financially, it was a blow. Private clinics, cozy private offices, expensive drugs, all this required money, and if before I could afford to pay for 1 or 2 sessions with a private specialist for psychological help, now the expense lists grew longer. Paid tests, medical consultations at the best clinics, unexpected trips to specialists, night taxis to drop Mom off at the next appointment, and I paid because I couldn't look at her pleas. She learned to look at me in a way that I couldn't refuse. Eyes, half smile, slightly broken voice. A combination like a snippet of a favorite melody that makes you feel warmer. The first months were filled with talks with doctors, but the oddity was that most doctors were small specialists in private offices who didn't keep long documentation and didn't have strict records in national databases. And when I tried to contact large university clinics, they told me they had no record of my mother. This was explained by bureaucracy and errors, but my inner anxiety grew because the stories didn't add up. How can a person undergo therapy courses in 3 different clinics at once, and yet no one keeps her records? Why does no one remember the addresses where she went for examinations? Mom, in the meantime, was dismantling my beliefs piece by piece. One day she said that every pain is a story, and added that she isn't seeking attention, but looking into her eyes. I saw a desire to be cared for, to be the center, and it created a strange dynamic. She was almost dependent on attention and on my role as savior. And I started performing a script that someone wrote before me, not me. One day I noticed an envelope with stamps in her room that seemed strange to me. On the front, the name of an insurance company she never mentioned, and looking closer, I saw there was a small sum, a payout on insurance. Mom seemed to have received money for a supposedly endured illness, and I felt everything inside contract, because insurance paid out for a serious illness isn't just money. It's a sign that someone confirmed the diagnosis, which means if the documents are fake, then someone somewhere resorted to using lies for money. But I couldn't immediately accuse Mom. I saw how hard it was for her, I heard her pleas, and I saw how she cried at night, and who was I to immediately throw accusations? I thought love was patience and acceptance, and so I hauled everything into the house that she might need. Paid for massages, for supportive procedures, agreed to everything, just so her smile was calm. And the more I gave, the more confident she seemed, and that gave her the strength to continue the game. Oddities build up gradually like ripples on water. First small mismatches, then calls from suspicious numbers asking to call back. Then, a meeting with a woman in a cafe who was crying and asking us for help, and my mother called her an old friend who needed support, and we paid because what could be wrong with helping people? We, a family helping other families. But these expenses and requests, seeming like charity, were woven into something more cunning. Someone around Mom was playing a dark game, and I increasingly felt like a pawn in it. At that point, I started writing everything down in a notebook: appointment dates, amounts, names, phone numbers. I did it quietly so Mom wouldn't notice. But when the notes started forming a picture, it became unpleasant. Payments went to addresses of private clinics that didn't have licenses for major oncological procedures. Calls came from the same number, but the caller introduced themselves with different names. And one woman who called herself a coordinator gave instructions that weren't by protocol. Pay this urgently, or we'll lose the chance. And it sounded like a scam script where emotions are used as leverage. And yet, even with the notes and doubts, I didn't dare throw them on the table and say, "You're lying." I was afraid to shame Mom, to destroy the little piece we had left, and most importantly, to lose what was considered normal: her smiles, evening teas, our little rituals. But doubt is like a weed, it grows and spreads, and the long months of support became a test for me, to keep the role of a caring son or to try to find the truth at any cost. The final push was a phone call from the bank. The manager asked to confirm a transaction, a large sum requested from Mom's card, and I felt everything inside change because the amounts leaving her account clearly exceeded her means. And suddenly it became clear that the illness wasn't just a reason for care. It was a mechanism that pulled finances along with it, and someone outside was benefiting. I sat at the table, opened the notebook, and realized there could be no more delay. I thought for a long time that it was all just coincidences, that the mix-up with dates, strange receipts, calls from coordinators, were just the result of bureaucracy. But the more I tried to convince myself that nothing terrible was happening, the stronger grew the feeling that I was living in some invented version of my life, and Mom was the director holding the script in her head, while I was just an actor who didn't know that the next scene had long been written. It all started with one detail that seemed insignificant. Mom always returned from treatments without the hospital smell. Those who have been to oncology centers know that smell, a mix of disinfectants, chlorine, and metallic sterility that seeps into clothes. But Mom smelled like perfume, sometimes coffee, sometimes even fresh bread. I tried not to notice until one day I asked, "Why don't you have any bracelets, papers, anything?" She smiled as if I'd asked a stupid question and said, "They do everything electronically there. You just don't know how things are set up now." I nodded, but inside I already knew she was lying. And that knowledge was heavy, like a stone in my chest, because I didn't want to believe that a mother could lie about cancer. The following weeks, I turned into a detective, though I didn't even realize it. I started making copies of all the papers I saw. In the evenings, while Mom slept, I went through her phone. It sounds awful, I know, but I couldn't do otherwise. When you feel that something foreign is hidden behind every word, you need proof. And then one day I saw it, correspondence with Dr. Vanderline, the very one who supposedly oversaw her treatment. But the number wasn't Dutch. I checked it. It was a regular prepaid number from Belgium. I sat in the dark, staring at the screen, and felt everything collapsing. One thing spun in my head. Why? The next day, I went to the clinic Mom called Amstel Medical Center. I didn't say who I was, just asked to confirm that patient Sophie Van Dijk was being treated there. The receptionist looked at the screen, clicked the mouse a couple of times, and said, "Sorry, we don't have such a patient." I said, "Maybe a mistake. She's been with you for several months." She replied, "We don't even have a doctor by the name you mentioned." And at that moment, standing at the desk, feeling my legs buckle, I realized this whole story isn't just strange. It's a lie, completely, from the beginning. I went out onto the street, sat on a bench, and for about 10 minutes just stared at one point. My head was buzzing. The world seemed plastic, like I was in a movie where I'd forgotten my line. The wind rustled the leaves, a tram clanged somewhere in the distance, people laughed, and inside me was the feeling like I'd died, but my body hadn't realized it yet. I didn't know what to do, scream, cry, confront. But if she lied, there must have been a reason. What? Manipulation, money, or fear that I'd leave. That night I didn't sleep. I flipped through my notes, receipts, letters, and the more I compared, the more I understood. The cancer story started right around the time I was planning to move in with my girlfriend in Rotterdam. I was on the edge then, a new job, relationship, new life. And that's when Mom said, "I feel bad, need to go to the hospital urgently." And then, "I have cancer." And I stayed. I felt cold, not from the wind, but from the thought that it was all planned, that her illness wasn't an accident but a tool. In the morning, I decided to check everything. I went to the pharmacy where she usually bought medications, showed the list. The pharmacist looked and said, "Some of these drugs have never been sold here. Others were just vitamins, and one turned out to be a supplement from the internet." I went out onto the street and I was shaking. I realized, that's it. This isn't a mistake. This is a lie. But how do you say that to the woman who gave you life? How do you utter, "I know you made it all up"? Because it's not just an accusation. It's a break in the bond that's held us all our lives. I called Mark, a childhood friend who'd always been there. He listened for a long time, then said, "Dan, maybe she needs help. Psychological. This isn't just a lie, it's an addiction to attention." "You mean she's sick, just not the way she says?" "Yeah," he said. "Sounds like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, through you." That was the first time I'd heard that term. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. When a person simulates illness, their own or someone, for sympathy, control, love. And the more I thought about it, the more the puzzles fit. But guesses are one thing, proof is another. I knew I needed to catch her in the act. The next days passed in some kind of trance. I went to work, smiled at colleagues, but everything inside was like a taut string. I started checking every word Mom said, every move. She said she was going to the clinic. I followed. Yeah, I felt like a scoundrel, but I had to know the truth. The first time I tailed her was on Monday. She left the house with a bag where she usually carried documents, got on the bus. I followed on my bike, lagging a block behind. The bus stopped at a shopping center. She got off and went not to the clinic but to a cafe, ordered coffee, sat by the window, pulled out a tablet and sat there for over an hour. Then left, went into a clothing store, bought something, and 2 hours later returned home. I came back later, as if I knew nothing. "How did the treatment go?" I asked. She smiled wearily. "Today was a long session, very hard, but I'm holding up." I felt nauseous. The next day I followed her again. She met some woman about 45. They sat in the park, drank coffee, laughed. I photographed everything from afar. And that evening I heard Mom on the phone saying, "Yeah, he still believes. Yeah, I'll make the transfer tomorrow." And that's when I realized this wasn't just a story for attention. This was a scheme. Money, manipulation, possibly blackmail. I pulled documents from her drawer, including the insurance. There was indeed a checkmark, compensation for oncological diseases. And attached were fake reports with a stamp from a doctor who didn't exist. Panic gripped me. If this comes out, she could face criminal charges, and if I stay silent, I'm an accomplice. I didn't know where to run. I went to that same Dr. Vanderline, to the address listed in the documents. It turned out to be a warehouse for old furniture. No clinic, no office, just the smell of dust and a lock on the door. I stood in front of that warehouse and realized I was living in an illusion. My mom wasn't a sick woman. She was a liar, and possibly a criminal. I got in the car and drove home without turning on the music. That evening, I sat across from her at the table, and for the first time in all this, couldn't look at her. She talked about a new course of therapy, and I thought about those papers lying in my bag. When she went to bed, I pulled out my phone, turned on the recorder, and quietly said, "Tomorrow I'll ask straight. If she lies, I'll tell everything." I didn't sleep until morning. The next morning, I woke up before her. The kitchen smelled of coffee. She'd brewed it the evening before to just reheat in the morning, as she always did. I sat across from the cup and watched the steam rise, dissolving in the cold air of the apartment. My heart was pounding somewhere in my stomach, my hands trembling. I knew, today everything changes. After today's conversation, there'd be no going back. When she entered the kitchen, in her robe with a smile, as if everything was as usual, I felt a strange pity. For the woman who'd been my center all my life, my support, but now seemed a stranger, as if in front of me wasn't Mom, but an actress playing Mom, and I'd finally seen the seams on her mask. "Mom," I said, trying to speak calmly, "we need to talk." She frowned slightly but sat down, without asking questions. "Of course, son, what's wrong?" I pulled out copies of the documents from the folder, those same fake reports, statements, insurance, laid them on the table. She froze, didn't touch the papers, just looked at me as if I'd just shown her something terrifying. "I was at the clinic," I said. "No one there knows you, and Dr. Vanderline doesn't exist." Silence. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. She looked away, her lips trembled. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said quietly. "I should have," I replied, "because I need to know what's going on." Her breathing faltered. She ran a hand through her hair, then stood up, went to the window. "You don't understand," she said finally. "I just wanted you to stay, so you wouldn't leave me." I looked at her and couldn't believe it. "You made up cancer so I wouldn't leave." My voice sounded dull, almost breaking. She turned around. There were tears in her eyes, but not the kind that evoke sympathy. These were tears of fear, of exposure. "After your father died, I couldn't be alone. You were the only thing I had left. When you said you were planning to move, I just couldn't. I got scared I'd lose you forever. So you decided to lie, pretend you're dying." "I thought it would be temporary." She stepped closer. "I thought you'd stay with me for a couple of months while I recovered. But then it went too far." I was silent, because inside there were no words, only emptiness. "And the money?" I finally asked. "You got insurance payouts, withdrew benefits, asked me for money for treatment." She lowered her eyes. "I needed something to make it all look believable. I thought I'd pay it all back later." I clenched my fists, feeling anger rise in my chest. Not hysteria, quiet, icy. "You stole years of my life, Mom. You made me believe you were dying. I lived every day thinking I was losing you, and you just were afraid to be alone." She stepped toward me, trying to touch my hand, but I pulled it away. "I did it all for love," she whispered. "This isn't love," I replied. "This is a prison." We stood in silence until a tram passed outside the window, leaving a short metallic screech behind. At that moment, I realized I couldn't stay here anymore. Not in this apartment. Not with her. I packed my things, without a scandal, without tears, just silently. She stood in the doorway, tried to speak, but I wasn't listening anymore. When I left the apartment, she shouted, "You'll understand. Someday you'll understand that I just wanted you to be close." I didn't turn around. The first days after that, I lived with Mark. He tried to joke, tried to distract me, but I was like burned out inside. All conversations seemed unreal. I'd walk down the street and see people laughing, hugging, and think, how do you do that? How can you trust anyone if even your mother can lie like that? A week later, I got a letter from the insurance company. They were conducting an investigation. Someone had reported possible fraud. I knew who. Me. I sent the documents, photos, conversation recordings. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I couldn't live with it as a secret. A month later, she was charged. I didn't go to the hearing. Mark said it was right, but I still felt ashamed. For her, for myself, for how it all ended. Then she wrote letters, long, rambling. Asked for forgiveness, said she understood she'd gone too far, that she wanted the best. I didn't reply, not because I hated her, but because I didn't know what to say. At some point, I realized I was no longer living her lie but my own, a lie of survival. I pretended everything was fine, that it was just a tough experience. But at night I'd wake from nightmares, like she was calling again and saying, "I have 6 months left." It took 2 years before I could really talk about it. I moved, changed my number, started over. And only recently, when I accidentally saw a woman in a cafe who reminded me of her, I realized I'm still waiting for her to call, to say, sorry. But maybe that's the curse of love. You can leave, but inside, a part of the one who destroyed you still remains. Sometimes I think, maybe I really should have understood. After all, she's not an enemy, just a person who couldn't handle loneliness. But then I remember those days, IVs that never happened, medications that turned out to be vitamins, her trembling hands when I asked about the doctor, and I realize, no, love doesn't give the right to turn someone else's life into a hostage. And maybe the only thing I've learned is not to save those who are drowning if they're pulling you under with them. 6 years have passed. I live in Copenhagen in an apartment with windows overlooking the canal, where tourist boats float by in the mornings, and sometimes their shouts wake me before the alarm. I have a new life, work, a woman I truly love, a dog who's always happy to see me, all the things I was afraid to allow myself. I rarely think about the past. Only sometimes, when the smell of coffee suddenly reminds me of that morning conversation in my mother's kitchen, or when someone says the word cancer, and something clicks inside, like someone turned off the light. That day I came home later than usual. In the mailbox was an envelope without a return address. Yellowed paper, neat handwriting. I recognized it immediately. This handwriting I'd seen 1,000 times on notes left on the fridge. "Son, dinner's in the oven. Don't forget to buy bread. I love you." I hesitated a long time to open the letter. Sat in the kitchen, turned on the light and just stared at it as if inside was a mine, not paper. Finally, I tore it open. "Dear my boy, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to write. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I live in a nursing home near Munich. I now really have cancer, this time for real, ironic, huh? The doctors say a little time left, but I'm not writing so you'll pity me. I just want to say that every morning when I wake up, I think not about the illness, but about you. I see you leaving that apartment without looking back. And I understand, that's when I lost everything. Not my son, the meaning. If you ever have a son, don't try to hold him with fear. Let him go. Let him follow his own path. I'm not asking to see you. I just wanted you to know I remember everything, and I love you. Mom. I finished reading the letter and just sat there, not moving. In my chest was a strange feeling, not anger, not pain, but weary acceptance, as if something quietly closed inside and it became easier to breathe. I didn't know if she was really sick again, maybe another manipulation, or maybe really the end. But for the first time in these years, I didn't feel fear, only gratitude for the fact that it was finally over. I didn't go to her, not because I hate her, just because sometimes forgiveness doesn't require a meeting. It just happens, inside you quietly, without words, without scenes. A month later, a postcard came from the shelter's administration. Short. Mrs. Kramer passed away peacefully in her sleep. She asked to convey that you were her pride. I put the postcard in the desk drawer. Didn't cry. Didn't drink. Just went out onto the street, breathed in the cold air, and walked along the canal. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt that I was living not for someone, not in spite of something, but simply because I can.